things I promised I'd go ahead and talk about within this episode that I didn't in the previous. We're going to do this episode a little bit differently than my normal format because of the two-parter nature and because of the unique situation that was happening about this time in Voyager in real life. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and talk about the episode in my normal manner. I actually only have a few notes when it really comes down to it. And then we're going to talk about the episode's construction, everything that's going on behind the scenes, and that kind of a thing. But first, I want to toss a tiny little bit of trivia at you, believe it or not. I actually did not know this until I was researching this episode for this video right now. There is a group called Foundation Imaging. I've actually heard of them. You may or may not have heard of them. They're one of the CGI groups out there. It's certainly not as big as ILM, but you know, that's what they do. They did a decent amount of, if not all of, the CGI work for a show you may or may not have heard of called Babylon 5. In this episode, they were actually called and said, you know, we want you to work on something. Now, if you've seen this episode, you probably actually know exactly what they worked on. It was the land deal. In case you're wondering, I actually did some research. Yeah, that was actually the official term for the creature. It was just land deal. Anyways, they did that, and while that was certainly well received and well done, then the producers were like, "Yep, okay," and Foundation Imaging was actually hoping to do more work with them, which turned out to be good because by the time we get to the episode "The Swarm," and I'll mention this when we get there, they were called back and said, "Hey, can you do more CGI work for us?" And that basically led to Foundation Imaging becoming the people who did the CGI work for Star Trek, the show, henceforth, for all intents and purposes. I believe all the way through Enterprise. I'll look into that later, but tiny little tidbit I just thought I'd share there. Now, oh my god. We've just discussed before in brief how Starfleet is written very schizophrenically. It's one of the problems you have with a franchise that goes on this long and with a situation where you have multiple different writers. So in Deep Space Nine, we see that Starfleet tends to have a decent amount of competence when it comes to emergency situations. In The Next Generation, we see both Starfleet officers who don't know what a splint is. I'm sorry, let me make this clear. Starfleet medical officers who don't know what a splint is, and Starfleet officers who know everything about survival situations, and a few things in between, too. In Voyager, it's the same schizophrenia. There have been a few episodes where they just have total ignorance of things that they really should, like, I don't know, the concept of a key comes to mind. And then they have episodes like this. Now, I'm bringing this up because they go out of their way to make Janeway look good in this episode. It probably doesn't surprise you that that's pretty much fully the influence of Jerry Taylor. Again, you know, it's funny, one of these days, as we get further into the series, I'm going to reach a point where I'm going to stop bashing Jerry Taylor. I mean this sincerely. I mean, I know. I've looked into it already. Later on, she does get a lot better about her writing, about her production. She tends to marry Sue Janeway a lot less, and she tends to be a lot more subtle in her presentation and her writing style. So great, I can't wait for that. But right now, the only way she could determine, I love this, the only way she could determine to actually make Janeway look good is she would have Janeway have all the answers. Watch the episode sometime. Chakotay says 2, 3, maybe 4 lines total throughout the whole thing that are good survival techniques. Let me say this again. The Maquis commander, who, you know, has been living in the boonies, so to speak, technologically wise and survivalist wise for forever, and actually was in charge of an entire group of people, he has a few lines. Janeway is constantly spouting about how incredible she is. Not literally, of course, she does I know everything. But instead, she actually gives all these survivalist tips and whatnot to everyone. Now, that only would bug me a little if not for the way they present it. They don't just have her giving the tips. Instead, they have a character act like they're incredibly stupid, and then she corrects them by telling them what they should actually do. You guess which character I'm about to say. Yes, that's right. The only way they could figure out to make Janeway look better is have Neelix, someone who has survived on his own, someone who endured, if not actually fought in a war, someone who was literally a scavenger and a plier of trades and merchandise and all that stuff. This guy, the guy who the supposed survivalist expert, is so stupid in this episode. And of course that's funny because, you know, we've only been told that a few thousand times already, right? I'm sorry, I'm just getting really sick of the Neelix is stupid as a plot element because, again, it only really exists to make Janeway look better because Neelix is like, I'm retarded. And then Janeway's like, no, no, here. This is what we should do. And then, like, the sun halos around her head. No, I'm kidding. I'm only kidding about one of those things, though. That's the sad part. And that just really grated on me. Now, that being said, you may be irritated at me because then I immediately am going to turn around and praise what they did with Tom Paris. The difference between Tom Paris being presented as good and Janeway being presented as good is the execution. This is kind of hard to explain, and it's always going to come down to individual preference. Let me just say what happens. I'm just going to say it flat out. Tom Paris, in a broken shuttle he is in the middle of fixing, successfully fights off and destroys a Kazon fighter that comes after him. What else do I need to add to that? But of course there is more to add to that, because presentation is very important, execution. The words on the paper don't necessarily mean anything until they actually get to the screen, right? So, if they had taken Janeway, if they had mentioned... okay, first of all, I think Chakotay would have been a better pick for the survivalist expert on the planet, because of everything I just mentioned, and also because Chakotay really does not get the screen time he deserves. I've complained about this before, and trust me, I'll be complaining about this actually more as the series goes on, as Robert Beltran's role just kind of fades as the series goes on. But ignoring that, if we want Janeway to be someone who has studied survival situations, and there is precedence for that, most captains are people, historically speaking, are individuals who know that kind of stuff. So, okay, I'm with that. I'm understanding of that. Why not just have her be the one issuing orders quietly, rather than doing this bouncing off thing that she had to keep doing of people who surrounding... It wasn't just Neelix. Neelix was the really bad one, but you don't... Remove the scenes with Neelix being an idiot. Either replace them with scenes of Neelix having a damn brain, or just have Janeway actually be the most competent person in a group of people who are at least moderately competent, and have her, rather than being the righteous one and I will show exactly how this situation is done, have her telling them bluntly and pointedly, this is what we need to do and this is how we need to do it and we need to do it in this time. And in the interests of fairness, there are some scenes where that comes across well. Now, to contrast this, the scene with Paris, the scenes with Paris really, but the first scene is the one I really want to analyze and dissect. You have him in the middle of trying to fix his shuttle. Now, first of all, we know Paris is good, a good mechanic, basically. I would call him a real engineer, but the term engineer applies to like 17 different things. So he's a really good, mechanically speaking, so he probably has a decent idea of how he knows how to fix the shuttle. That doesn't bother me. He's a really good pilot, and he's also fought before for Starfleet and for the Maquis, and for Voyager, for that matter. So his competence as far as his ability in space combat doesn't bother me at all. He's also fighting the Kazon, who are the Kazon. So in other words, what I'm trying to get across here is that none of what he did felt like Mary Sue-ness to me, because all of it made sense with the character, all of it made sense with the setting, and all of it just served to emphasize not how great he was, but only how competent he was. A few things later will make Paris seem a little bit too great as opposed to competent, but we'll get to those when we get to them. So I just wanted to really present that, because, okay, for example, a good way to do the Tom Paris thing wrong would be to have him act really suave the whole time, or superior, or flippant. For him to just be like, computer, as he said, computer, do this complicated maneuver, and he's just kind of like almost dull, bored, doing it with the back of his mind kind of thing. Instead, what we see is Tom actually getting up, getting to his seat, irritated, of course, because he's trying to fix the thing, and he actually shouts, I don't have time for this! And then destroys the ship, and he's like, ugh, and then he gets back to work. See, that's a lot more human reaction than the more Mary Sue reaction, which is the, just, computer, whip up 5911 62-3345 or something, whatever. And, evasive maneuvers, pattern delta, Although delta wouldn't actually, pattern omega would probably help in this case, but then again, I'm quoting STO, so moving on. The other thing they do, though, is they constantly emphasize how Paris is basically barely making do with what he does. This goes throughout the whole episode. Paris is at the point where he tries to he tries to get a hold of the Talaxians, tries to coordinate with the Doctor, tries to arrange this whole thing. He's doing his job a job he's good at, a job he was good at in the Maquis as well, let's be honest with ourselves. But at no point does he feel like he's completely on top of the situation. Does that make sense? Now, by contrast, now I've already talked about Janeway enough. I don't want to go into that. I do want to mention one little side note. We have only heard it mentioned once ever, actually, that the Talaxians were renowned as good warriors. That was actually way back in the season one under whose name I can't think of. Jutrell, that's it, the episode Jutrell. This episode brings that up again. That point will actually be mentioned several times throughout the series. It's usually just a tiny background thing, but it is mentioned again in this episode and shown, given the Talaxians' ability to just basically win the battle that comes up. Granted, they had some help. Granted. But that still makes sense because Voyager is way more superior than anything else. It's actually kind of funny when you think about it because forgive me for sounding like I'm detracting, but it felt like the Voyager crew had to work more and do more to retake their ship from the freaking Kazon, who know nothing, than the Kazon had to do to take the ship to begin with. But I already really covered that in the first episode, so there's no reason to go over that. Let's go ahead and... Okay, I'm going to talk about this more in depth in a minute here. But I do want to give one tiny bit of praise, and this is pretty much full-on Beltran's performance, so props to the man. You keep asking me, how do I prove that he's a decent performer? In one scene, the natives, the local alien natives, who I don't think are even actually given a name, have kidnapped Kes, right? And they've got Kes. I don't remember if this is the scene where they've got Neelix or not, because it doesn't really matter. The point is, no, it is. They do have Neelix, or don't have Neelix. Excuse me. Chakotay is going to negotiate with them. Now, obviously, their universal translators are not working because plot, and they don't really have any way to actually communicate with these people, right? Well, wrong, because that... See, the thing is, we in real life, and indeed historically for years, and historically within Star Trek, have had many ways of actually communicating without actually being able to understand the words coming out of each other's mouths. And one of the best ways to communicate is through tone and body language. Definite props to Robert Beltran. He's very relaxed. He's in a very relaxed pose where he's obviously non-threatening. He's not buffing himself up. He's not trying to rant or rage. And let's see if I can try and emulate it, because it's actually kind of hard to do. He's got a very relaxed tone. There's nothing he's trying to do, verbally or physically, in order to try and, tell them that he is a threat to them. And as he's telling them this, they can just listen to his calm, measured words, because he's not rushing the words either, like I usually do. I usually talk much faster than I actually do for the show, to be honest with you. And so he's very slowly talking, with very measured steps, and very other things. I just wanted to praise that because that's pretty much exactly what was needed for the situation, and is exactly what I would expect for that kind of a pseudo-first contact trying to communicate scene. Of course, Neelix then immediately ruins it by literally shouting, "No! And doing this!" Which is the exact opposite if you're paying attention to Chakotay's approach. So, Neelix is stupid! Oh my god. Alright, let's rip this episode apart now. I do have some praise to say about this episode. In fact, actually, let's go and add one thing. While I overall am irritated by this episode, I really enjoyed rewatching it more than I thought I would. And the reason why could be best described as the Doctor and Sudor. I'm dead serious. Picardo's portrayal of the Doctor in this episode was amazing. Not really a surprise, he's usually amazing, but nevertheless, he was pretty much top-notch in this episode. The Doctor having to be the insurgent, trying to retake the ship from the inside, and trying to make do with stuff that he's basically never been programmed to do, ever. But the whole time, he's not whining about it so much as he is actually genuinely looking at it like, how do I do this? How do I make it through this? And then he contacts Sudor. The two's dynamic is incredible, first of all. Second of all, the way the Doctor has to basically try to counsel Sudor, something he doesn't really fully know how to do. As has been mentioned before in Voyager, there is no counselor on Voyager. So it's a shame Counselor Troy was not available. But seriously, there's no counselor available, so the Doctor doesn't really have the knowledge, know-how, programming experience, etc., in order to really fill that role. So you can tell in his words that he's trying to encourage Sudor, and yet, especially early on in the episode, he's doing it in pretty much exactly the wrong way. And later on in the episode, you can tell the Doctor has started to get some of his footing, especially when he gives that last speech through the message to Sudor. He's finally realized exactly what he needs to tell Sudor, and indeed how to tell him that. It was a nice little development over the course of the episode. And I have nothing but praise for Brad Dourif. Oh my god. I'm going to talk about him and Sudor a little bit more later when we get to the big things there. But suffice it to say, his portrayal was incredible as always. I loved the portrayal of Sudor in this episode. When I first saw this episode way back when, my mother and I both, who were, I've mentioned this before, we both had basically the same reaction. We actually cried when Sudor died. That's how much of an impact his portrayal and his performance and his character had on us. I've already talked in the first episode about his development in his quote-unquote third personality, where he was the one who was trying to recover, trying to hold back and trying to reintegrate into society. In this one, we see a fourth personality. Now we see someone who is effectively a recovering alcoholic. So I kind of mentioned this before. He is someone who never wants to kill again, ever. He genuinely does not want to do it. And he knows that if he does, he might not be able to stop. And he might relapse into his first personality, and into the guy who's constantly, afraid of killing and whatnot. And he's just struggling and straining and doing everything he can within his power in order to avoid this inevitability. And when he finally actually kills a Kazon in this episode, he actually crumbles onto the ground, onto his knees, and curls up into a ball, and is sitting there shaking faintly. That was so amazing, and just really, really spot-on performance for someone in that circumstance. I felt so bad for that character. Let's go ahead and move on, though. Let's talk about... God, where do we start? Where do we start? I'll ask the obvious question first. It's literally the first thing I wrote down. Why are the natives in this episode? Don't try to fling any racism thing. It's not going to work. Why are the natives in this episode? Now you may look at me and be like, well, they're there to add tension. No, no, okay. Already, before the natives are ever even introduced, by the way, they're only in episode 2. They weren't in Basics Part 1 at all. I'll talk a little bit about why in a moment. Already, before the introduction of them, we have hostile alien planet that the crew has to survive on. Okay? We have the Sudor story. Well, it's really the Sudor and the Doctor's story, them trying to retake the ship, that kind of a thing. Okay. We have the Cesska story and the culmination of her plots. Okay. All of these things are interesting things by themselves. We can also add the retake Voyager if we care, but let's be honest with ourselves, we're pretty sure that that's going to happen at the end of the episode anyway, so let's go ahead and just remove that point there. We still have 3 major plot threads, which are strong, interesting, and we're like, yeah! Why add the natives? Why add another plot thread? What do they add to this episode? Let's see. They threaten the crew, so nothing, because the planet was already threatening the crew. They let Chakotay act magical, so nothing, because that detracts from his character rather than adds to it, in my opinion. I'm not even going to talk about the the convection scene. I'm not even going to talk about it. When he's on the lava. Okay, I'm going to start reaching. I'm going to actually pull it technically here, because that's how bad I have to go to try and figure out something that the natives add to the story. The natives add the Roddenberry ideal of reaching out to, other people who are different than you and getting along with them. There you go. Okay, that's what it adds to the episode. Great! Wonderful. Why then, now that we've actually determined that there was a purpose behind the natives, why were they in this episode? Why bloat the episode out with them? In fact, if you pay attention to the screen time, the natives plot actually has more time than any other plot, unless you count Retaking Voyager, which encompasses several, as another plot by itself. Why? Why not have that be its own episode? You could do that. You could literally do that in any episode. You could literally have any old episode about the natives and the recombining. Sure, fine, do it. Have Magic Chakotay. Well, okay, don't. Do it properly, but you could still do it. Why throw it in here? It's so freaking unnecessary. Oh my god. But I mentioned I was going to talk about why the natives just kind of magically appear in this episode, and that is what we call the best of both worlds problem. I've probably mentioned this before, I don't actually recall, and I know I'll be talking about it in the future in every single case in which it is relevant, because it keeps coming up. For those of you who don't know what I know, or know what I mean, excuse me, Best of Both Worlds, Part 1 and 2, but Best of Both Worlds, Part 1 especially, one of the greatest episodes of all time in Star Trek, was written without knowing how Best of Both Worlds Part 2 would end. Now, that's a very commonly known fact. There's a lot of reasons why, and I'm not going to go into all of them now. It was pretty much all behind-the-scenes stuff. Some actors, some directors, some producers, some writing stuff. A lot of things were happening behind the scenes. We're not going to cover that. The pertinent point is Best of Both Worlds Part 1 was written without knowing how Best of Both Worlds Part 2 would come into fruition. Now, that was not necessarily a bad thing for two very important reasons. Number one, I mean for a lot of reasons, but two big reasons. Number one, Best of Both Worlds Part 1 specifically ended from a stylistic perspective, from a thematic perspective, as an open door. It's actually really hard to explain, but because it sounds like, what do you mean? Anything can't happen. No, the thing is, though, the way they constructed it with Picard as a Borg, with the ship ready to fire, with Riker having taken his command, with Riker having gone through his character arc through Best of Both Worlds Part 1, all the things that happened were all setting up to a complete setting changer, which is ironic because that is actually what happened in Best of Both Worlds Part 2. But moving on. You could have done basically anything at that point and made it make sense because Best of Both Worlds Part 1 laid the foundation. You understand? The second really important thing that happened is when Best of Both Worlds Part 2 came out, they really poured their heart and souls into it. Granted, most people agree that Part 2 is not as good as Part 1, but most people still agree that Part 2 is still good, indeed amazing, actually. I am one of those people, obviously. But the truth remains, they really put forth their best performance into Best of Worlds Part 2. Now, that being said, the reason this is a problem is because Star Trek started emulating this and actually never stopped. The pattern of make a season cliffhanger without designing how it's going to end became a thing pretty much from that point on. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let me point out that the last season cliffhanger that ever happened in Star Trek to date, as of now, was the end of the Xindi arc in Season 3 of Enterprise, which was written by a completely different person and crew who would be writing the follow-up to it. And let's just say a lot of people think that it was deliberately made kind of terrible specifically out of spite, basically, so that the people now taking over for Season 4 would have a lot of baggage they had to get through, which they did, by the way, props to them, at least in my opinion. But yeah, the whole space Nazi thing, again, written without knowing how it was going to end. Now, I will be pointing this out again each time it's relevant as we go through these franchises and series and episodes, but the thing is, if you really paid attention, there really were, there's a lot of factors into this, but there really were only two reasons why that worked in Best of Both Worlds, and there are a few cases where it actually works. We'll be getting to Scorpion later. It worked there. But if you don't lay the foundation, and if you don't really try on Part 2, you get this. Or other examples like this, like, let's just say Unimatrix comes to mind. Anyways, Unimatrix 0. I'm actually going to quote something. I've got some quotes pulled up here. This is Jerry Taylor. What do we do? How do we get them off of there? It's one of those corners you paint yourself into, and so we had our work cut out for this when we came back and we got them off. In other words, by the staff's own admission, and there's several other comments like this, they had basically pushed themselves into a corner, and now they had to figure out how to get themselves out rather than laid the foundation for a good follow-up and then really put their best effort into part two. Now, you might be asking, well, how do you know they didn't put their best effort into part two? Well, one, I've seen the episode, but two, there was a lot of infighting going on behind the scenes about Basics Part 2. For those of you who are not aware, Michael Piller, a name that should sound very familiar to anybody who's a fan of Star Trek and science fiction in general, this was actually the last episode he worked on at all of Voyager, as far as a writing staff. He remained on as a consultant, but for all intents and purposes, this was when he got kicked upstairs. He stopped being one of the frontliners. Michael Piller really wanted the story arc to go in a specific direction. I mentioned this back in part one, the Roddenberry ideal, and we really need to get back to our basics, and we really need, he felt like the show was about to take off. Everyone else completely disagreed with him. Whether that was true or not, it is worth noting that Piller kept trying to fight to get out the story he felt would be a good one, and he was shot down pretty much all of the way. Let me go ahead and mention some of the things he was trying to do. And I'm not going to say whether these are good or bad. I'm just going to let you guys determine your own opinion. For example, his first thought was that he wanted the child to die, the one, Cesska's baby, to die. Now, if you're going to kill a child in fiction, you really have to do it carefully, and I kind of agree that it would be very unlikely that Voyager, of all shows, would actually be able to pull that off well. But I do actually get where he was going with that. Thematically, it makes a lot of sense. For one, it shows the ultimate culmination of all that Cesska has done. The end result of all her machinations, all her manipulations, is that the one and only thing she genuinely cared about is now lost to her. And that would have been a springboard into her next character arc, basically, if you understand. So I get that. The second reason is it would be a nice pseudo bookend and mirror for the events that happen in this episode, which Piller also fought for, which was the birth of Naomi Wildman, who will actually be joining the crew as a character later on, believe it or not. And I kind of get that, but he was shot down really hard by that, not just by the other writing staff, but by the actual executives of the show. So that was not happening. That meant the child had to live. Here's the problem, and here's where that writing into a corner really comes in. Once you have a number of variables here. We've got Cesska, Sudor, Koa, and the baby. All four of these, that's four. All four of these, I can count, have to be dealt with in some way at the culmination of this episode. Okay, now Sudor isn't really a part of this equation, so we'll leave him off. But of these three, we have now set in stone the baby must live. Now, there's only a few things that can happen for the baby to survive. So one of the first things that was done was the baby was changed to not be Chakotay's. That was a huge and very controversial change, but unfortunately one that was absolutely required, because the only way that they could have the baby be Chakotay's is have the baby stay on the ship. There's no way Chakotay would just let his child, go off with Koa or whatever. And the repetition of that kind of going after my kid arc was something they feel would not really work well, and I kind of agree with them on that. So the baby had to not be Chakotay's, even though everything else was leading up to the fact that it actually was. Sure, whatever. If the baby lives, the baby has to not be Chakotay's. You see how this is how the Tetris blocks start to fit in here. So now that the baby is not Chakotay's, and it has to live, because both these are now set in stone, we have to do something with either Cesska or Koa surviving. Now, the thing is, the original intent after that was Cesska was going to go ahead and live. In fact, here, let me pull up this quote. Okay, hang on. We're actually going to skip down here. They actually changed the script a lot. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Yeah, he's not even going to mention all the things here. My apologies. I apparently have the wrong thing up. Point being, with that done, Koa... Oh, that's right. Okay, so the next thing that was going to happen was Koa was going to die. Okay, Koa dies, Cesska lives, Cesska has Koa's child, but the intent with that was to basically... That kind of threw a wrench into the possibility of Cesska's character arc continuing, especially given the fact that Cesska herself really wanted that child to be Chakotay's for reasons that's basically already been covered by previous episodes. So that was just kind of... it didn't really fit. Possible, but it was kind of a wrench. So, okay, fine. So Cesska dies. Okay, big culmination of Cesska's character arc. Yeah, okay, we'll do that. Cesska will die, and it'll be the big. Now, okay, for those of you who've actually seen this episode, you know why I'm making fun. I'm just going to quote Martha Hackett here. If I can find the quote here. Where is it? Here it is. This. I was always grouchy about the way they killed me off, because there should have been a showdown between Janeway and Cesska. The whole thing with the ship getting bumped, and the baby survives, but I don't. That's nutty. For Cesska to die like that way was rolling over. Or excuse me, for Cesska to die that way was like rolling over, excuse me. Martha Hackett and a lot of people, including Michael Piller, were really upset about how Cesska died. And by the way, count me in amongst those. For those of you who have not seen the episode, what I just quoted is pretty much literally true. The ship takes one of its usual shakes, and Cesska dies. That's it. That's all. Kulla picks up the child, and then walks off without a word, I might add. And that's it. That's the end of this Kazon. We never see the Kazon again, other than references or them being in time travel or a holodeck kind of a thing. We never see Cesska again, except for everything I just mentioned. In fact, I think Cesska only appeared in one other episode after this. I could be wrong about that. And the child is never mentioned again because it wasn't Chakotay's child, so we've effectively... Now, I think the reason this bugs me so much, ignoring the fact that it was really poorly executed, is the fact that the obvious intent was to try and get back to the status quo as hard as possible. And that irritates me. It's something that's always irritated me about fiction in general, but especially about Star Trek. The desire to cling to the status quo rather than accepting change and alteration of the setting. One of the reasons Deep Space Nine sticks out so strongly in my mind is they were so willing to challenge the status quo and actually have things happen that changed the setting, that made long-term effects and impacting and characterization and blah, blah, blah. Now, that's not to say the other Star Treks haven't done this from time to time, Next Generation being a big one for that matter. But every time it's the opposite of that. Voyager is really, really bad about the reset button. And Basics Part 2 is literally, as I've already quoted from the writers, producers, an attempt to get back to the status quo as quickly and as hard and as haphazardly as possible. I think that's my biggest problem with this episode. Yeah, Cesska's death was just, oh my god. Let me go ahead and mention another thing. I mentioned before about how this episode was not, they obviously didn't put their full best effort into it. According to information from Martha Hackett, the woman who plays Cesska, if I hadn't made that clear, she actually was getting script revisions almost daily up to 2 days before the shoot. In other words, by her own word, and we do have to take her word on this, but Piller backs her up on this, as of 3 days before shooting, her character was going to live, and they were going to do the character arc thing, and then as of 2 days, when they finally get the finalized script, she was going to die. And that was her warning. 2 days before shooting, 2 days before they actually got out in front of the camera, she found out she was going to die. That really speaks to how much infighting and backbiting was happening behind the scenes about this episode, and how much everyone was just constantly going back after each other. And from what I understand, now this is juxtaposition, this is assumption, but from what I understand, and from everything that's been coming from it, I don't think it was just Piller versus everyone else. I think nobody could agree with how this episode should have gone. And I think that's one of the reasons why they went with the status quo route. I know, I just bashed this episode about that, and indeed I will be bashing this episode one last time before I stop this. But I do kind of understand the desire to push for status quo, because if your writing staff is completely incongruent and has no ability to make a consensus with regards to how one episode should go, fundamentally altering the setting and the status quo is probably not something you want to be considering at that point in time. Now, I said I'd bash this episode. Well, you may or may not know, I tend to run through these videos in my head a little bit to get kind of an idea of what I want to do, as my own little rehearsal. And when I was rehearsing this scene, I literally threw my pen at the table because I was so pissed off. I like Sudor, and in no small part that is thanks to Brad Dourif being a phenomenal actor. He is one of my favorite actors who gets so little attention for how incredible he is. I don't really know what else to add to that. Brad Dourif is amazing. But I did genuinely like the character of Sudor, even discounting that. He was an interesting character to me. He was the kind of character Star Trek has approached, but has never actually had as a main cast member, and arguably has only had as a regular cast member, or excuse me, a regular guest star once previously. And another amazing actor who I also love in just about everything he's in. I can't think of his name off the top of my head because I'm an idiot, but he's the gentleman who played Reginald Barclay, or Broccoli, if you get the joke. In other words, this is someone who is effectively not part of the clique. Now, not to make fun of Star Trek, even though I'm making fun of Star Trek, not to bash Star Trek, not to try and sound negative about Star Trek, but one of the things Star Trek has done since the original series is a lot of the main characters tend to come across as a clique, as a tight-knit, a club, basically, and other people aren't really allowed in the club, and they tend to be rather elitist towards people who aren't in the club. Now, some of that is a byproduct of the times when it comes to television. In other words, the regular cast members, get screen time, and they some of that's actually written into their contract. I've mentioned the Avery Brooks example. But it's also because of the fact that they're the only ones that they can actually afford to pay to show up on the screen regularly, so they end up doing more stuff, even though logically speaking it would make sense for other things. This goes all the way back to the original series. Why does Kirk always go down on the planets? And you might say, well, it's because he's Kirk. Well, no, see, that's what they did with that. But the reason it's Kirk always going down is because of the click thing, is because of the fact that he's a regular cast member and he has to be the one who gets the screen time. Now, they did do something with that. They did flesh out his character and make him be the frontiersman as a result of that, so props to them. But the point is, especially in the TNG and Voyager era, it really came across as feeling like the main cast members were a caste. CASTE, to make that clear, is what I mean. And all the rest of the... they were the higher, they were the aristocracy. There we go. We'll put it that way. They were the aristocracy, and all the other members of the crew, even the guest stars who were semi-regular, like Hogan, who dies in this episode. And that's basically all I have to add to that, because that's kind of how it comes across. Here's Hogan, and he's dead. Although, in fairness, Hogan will actually come in later, so props to that. But yeah, so it always comes across as they're a lesser caste. And Sudor was someone who, like Barclay, had a lot of potential because he clearly and definitively did not fit into that aristocracy caste. And he clearly and definitively had some genuine, serious problems with him, personality-wise, and with regards to his history and his past. He was also someone who very strongly had a genuine feel of wanting to repent, wanted to redeem himself, was actively pushing and struggling and straining to be a better person, which, if you're paying attention, is exactly what the Roddenberry ideal was originally supposed to be. It was one of the big things. We strive to better ourselves. And that poor man, who was a murderer, let's not discount that. I'm not trying to paint him as some saint or hero. He was a terrible person, but he was trying to be better. And that is interesting. That is an interesting character. That is someone I want to see more of. That is someone I want to see interact with more than just Tuvok and Janeway. That is someone I want to see bounce off of Paris, who also understands what it's like to do bad things and do horrible things and to regret it and to try and repent. Or how about, I can't think of her name. B'Elanna. Another person who would probably be able to sympathize to some extent or another with Sudor. Or how about the Doctor, one of the only people in the crew who genuinely would have no prejudice against him and therefore would be the one who would be able to open him up and crack his shell. Think about all the character dynamics that Sudor could have had if he was kept on the show, which was the original intent, by the way. Which is another reason I'm pissed off. But no, and I'm going to quote Pillar on this. It was a real wipeout. Jerry never cared for Sudor and had no interest in developing him any further. So there was no point in keeping him alive. You twit. There, I threw my pen again. Slightly less violently than last time. The reason I was so pissed about that, though, is because they at least did something with Sudor. They made him die a hero, for all intents and purposes. He really did. He went down fighting, doing the one thing he didn't want to do, and barely struggling through it all because he was trying to help. And he died for that. Now, you could actually point out something to me. You could say, well, Arsh, hang on, hang on. You talked about the whole recovering alcoholic analogy and how, he is now killed, so how then could he reintegrate into society having just recently tasted it? To which I respond two things, or in two ways, I should say. One, yes, absolutely. Think about how much harder it would be now for him, after all the progress he's made, to basically lose all of it. To have so backlashed because of this whole Kazon fight that now he is really struggling and just barely keeping it together. Or, two, the obvious answer. Phasers have a stun setting. In actual fact, when we first saw this episode, my mother and I, we both assumed it was. We're not even 100% sure if it's true or not, but we both assumed that he was in fact using the stun setting in his big final scene. Which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it from a character perspective and from the perspective of just Star Trek in general. Now, he does kill that one Kazon. We all agree on that. He drags the Kazon up there and he freaks out completely about it. Definitely, yes. But in the final moment, when he was given the last speech, you have to do this, the reason I love it so much more if he used the stun setting is because that is him actually standing up against his addiction, his mental problem, his inability, and saying no, and not murdering all those people, not killing all those Kazon. I shouldn't even say murder, because it's not murder. It is killing. Those are enemy combatants in a war situation, so that is pure killing, justified for all intents and purposes, especially since they were the aggressors. But he still didn't. He managed to stay true to himself and his desire to not be a killer, and at the same time was able to help the ship and save everyone. And he got shot in the back for it. And that's probably one of the only reasons why, even though I'm pissed off that they got rid of him, I still really like the way that happened, if one is to assume that those guns were on stun. We never actually know for 100% certainty if they were on stun or not. We don't. But in my opinion, it works so much better if the gun was on stun. It partially explains why the last Kazon was able to get, but more importantly, it's such a culmination of his character arc. And then he dies for it. What am I hearing? Anyways, whatever. I'm done. I'm done with talking about things. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and I will be talking to you in the next video soon.